Monday, December 2nd, 2019, MONERO 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Earlier today, I made a video about gold being sound money and everything else being speculation, right? And lo and behold, I saw an article come out in the FT about the Federal Reserve, and the article says U.S. Federal Reserve considers letting inflation run above target. Federal Reserve always says that it's working in the interest of the American public, the general public, but of course it's not. Federal Reserve is an inflation machine. What is inflation? Well, it's a tax on the most vulnerable in society. It's not a tax on the wealthiest. The wealthiest always get around inflation. They have enough wealth to protect themselves, right? They don't depend so much on their paycheck to earn a living, right? They're able to put aside and get out of Federal Reserve notes or fiat currency and protect themselves. Before I go into the article and show you some calculations about inflation and how it's affected the purchasing power of the dollar and how probably it will affect the inflation will affect it going forward. I'd just like to say that I've got a promo code or promotion in my MONERO 64 Teespring store. It's up until the end of the day today. It's a 20% off promotion. There's some interesting mugs there, other merchandise like t-shirts and stickers. One of my favorites is this one. I just got it myself. I bought it with a discount. It says become your own central bank, keep stacking. It's got a sovereign on it. The other side it says don't get caught holding the bag. It's got a silver Britannia on it. There's also a similar one with American coins on it. These are English coins, of course. And then the most popular mug, of course, especially since I'm going to talk about the Fed and how they're considering increasing their inflation target. This is the mug that's the most popular. It's the End the Fed mug. It says robbing Americans since 1913, End the Fed, right? So let's get to the article. Let's have a look here. So it's come out in the FT. And it says U.S. Federal Reserve considers letting inflation run above target. Bid to avoid weak price growth would be biggest policy revamp since 2012. It's by someone called Brendan Greeley. Let's go through it. It came out 10 hours ago. The Federal Reserve is considering introducing a rule that would let inflation run above its 2% target, a potentially significant shift in its interest rate policy. The Fed's year-long review of its monetary policy tools is due to conclude next year, and according to interviews with current and former policymakers, the central bank is considering a promise that when it misses its inflation target, it will then temporarily raise that target to make up for lost inflation. Well, to make up for not confiscating as much wealth from the public, right? People, you need to wake up. Central banks are not benign institutions. They're here to basically redistribute wealth from the general public to the top 1%, or not even, maybe less than 1%, right? The idea would be to avoid entrenching low U.S. price growth, which has consistently undershot its goal. If the Fed adopts the so-called make-up strategy, yeah, they don't know what they're doing, right? They're just going with the flow, right? It would mark the biggest shift in how it carries out its interest rate policy since it began to target 2% inflation in 2012. Policymakers are frustrated by the failure of prices to hit their target, even as U.S. unemployment has plumbed 50-year lows. Well, I would say one way to basically how can I say, fixes would be to go back to how CPI was calculated prior to Paul Volcker in the early 80s. It would be running at maybe 10%. But then again, it would bring the whole house of cards, the endless debt they're creating, down, right? It would bring it all down. This is just a deception to try to keep interest rates low, to keep the system from imploding. Of course, there's more inflation. This is just it's a scam, basically. And they go on to say the new policy would require making it clear that it's acceptable that to average 2%, you can't have only observations that are below 2%. Eric Rosengren, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, said in an interview in the Financial Times last week. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, right? Towards the end here, this is what they're looking to do. It says Fed Governor Leo Brainard, speaking to reporters last week, said that a strict makeup rule would be too hard to explain to the public. Like Mr. Rosengren, she preferred a more flexible approach, such as suggesting a target of 2 to 2.5% inflation after a period of misses. She goes on to say that's a fairly simple thing to communicate to the public. People need to learn that, first of all, what they're talking about is not inflation, because inflation technically is a rise in the amount of money and credit created in the system, and the Fed is the main engine of inflation alongside its agent banks, right? What they're talking about is the phony consumer price index, which is a measure of a rise in prices, which is a consequence of the inflation, right? So she goes on to say, it's very important, obviously, for those rules to work effectively, that financial market participants, households, and businesses all understand what you're doing. Let's go look at history first. Let's compare how the dollar performed from 1800 to 1913. Granted, the second Bank of the United States was around until 35 or 37. I'm not too sure exactly. I think it was 37. Andrew Jackson did not renew the charter for it, for the second Bank of the United States. So the U.S. was without a central bank from 1837 to 1913. Operationally, it was 1914. So I've looked here at westag.com/inflation. It's an inflation calculator, a US inflation calculator. I did a little calculation here, very simple. What cost $1 in 1800 would cost 58 cents in 1913. So the purchasing power of the dollar went up during that period, right? Despite the fact that we had a central bank for a while there in the early 1800s, right? The other way to look at it is also if you were to buy exactly the same products in 1913 and 1800, they would cost $1 in 1913 and $1.76 respectively in 1800. So there you go. That was a period where there was deflation. The rate of inflation was negative. Did the world end in the 19th century? No. Of course, there was the Civil War, which was very disruptive. All in all, though, it was a period of great expansion, not only territorially for the United States, but also economically, industrially, geopolitically, right, with deflation. So now, let's compare that when the United States basically didn't really have a central bank to now, since 1913 until 2018, which is the latest data they provide. Let's do the same little test. So here we go. What cost $1 in 1913 would cost $25.65 in 2018. And I would argue that it's probably undervalued that, because they're using official CPI data or inflation data, right? I would say it's much worse. Also, if you were to buy exactly the same products in 2018 and in 1913, they would cost you $1.04 respectively. So there you go. The dollar's lost 96% of its value with the Federal Reserve, the inflation machine, right? And they're looking to tax you even more with inflation, right? So I've done a little test here because right now they've got a target of 2%, right? CPI or inflation, whatever you want to call it. So if they allowed inflation, the inflation that they look at to drop to 1%, for example, you'd think, oh, that's bad, you know, that's good for the general public, only 1% inflation. But as you can see here on this website, impact of inflation calculator, right? So I've done a little test here as well. Based on an inflation rate of 1% in 10 years time, the estimated value of your money in today's term might be $90.53. So even when the rise in prices is next to zero, around 1%, the value of your the money in your pocket, the Federal Reserve note in your pocket, decreases almost by 10% over 10 years, right? Let's say that they decide to implement a target for their CPI or inflation at 2.75%. In that article that I just read, they're talking about 2 to 2.5. But let's say things get pretty bad economically and they think, oh, we need to go to almost 3%. So I've taken 2.75%, which sounds quite tame, right? And I've done it over 10 years. And look at the result. You would have lost a quarter of the purchasing power of your currency or of your Federal Reserve note, or if you want to call it a dollar, which is technically not right either, right? Because constitutionally, the dollar is a weight of silver and gold. But there you go. Yeah, the Federal Reserve, they're looking to keep taxing the general public. So why can't we go back to like in the 19th century? No central bank, right? Or even if we did have a central bank, why wouldn't the Fed try to keep inflation at zero? We knew growth and development was very good in the 19th century. Well, I'll tell you why. Because the Federal Reserve is there. It exists not for the benefit of the general public. It exists as a banking cartel to control the money supply and to enrich the bankers, to keep inflating the system more and more. And they've come to a juncture where they need to keep inflating or else the system implodes. And how do the bankers benefit from this inflation? Well, the inflation is created by the creation of debt and credit. The more debt and credit there is, the more money the bankers make. They always take a cut, right? So there you go. I wouldn't trust what the Fed says about inflation for the general public. For us, it's actually a huge tax. For the very wealthy, the 1%, they don't care. They're going to get even wealthier. What's the only way to protect yourself? If you have spare Federal Reserve notes, if you have savings, well, if you want to invest and speculate, go for the stock market. I'm not stopping you. But if you want to save and sleep soundly at night, I would say precious metals, of course. They maintain their purchasing power over time, and it looks like they're going to maintain their purchasing power even more relative to fiat currencies. Seeing that the Fed is putting it out there, they're going to inflate things even more. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you share it far and wide as well. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. And you can also follow me on Steemit, DTube, and on Twitter. I wish you all a great day. Take care. Bye.